Okay, we had stopped. I think we had done this before, but we want to go over it once more. There's one sentence of Marx that has not aged. In actual history, it is a notorious fact that conquest, enslavement, robbery, murder, in short, force play the greatest part. Okay, so force is very important in the actual history. Now, of course, in actual history, it is a notorious fact that conquest, enslavement, robbery, murder, in short, force play the greatest part. But we should make further distinctions between the type of force and the types of circumstances in which different types of forces are needed. So, for example, without trying to be exhaustive, just as an example, force can be a physical force. So at times you need physical force. That's surely important in history. Then there's the social force. Then from another perspective, you have external force. Then you have internalized force. You have force of values and ideologies. So we can't just think of physical force. If we are, I don't know what Marx was thinking. Probably he was thinking of physical force mainly in that context. But if we are talking about force and its relation to revolution, for example, total transformation, then we have to fine grain our concept of force, and also what type of force is needed at what stage of change, and also the type of change. For different types of changes, you will need different types of forces. Not just different types of forces, but different quantity of force, for example. Just conceptually speaking, at the moment. And also the type of force you need or apply, and the quantity of or the amount of force you need to apply will not just depend on the type of change you are trying to affect, but also the context in which you are trying to make that change. So certain societies might be more liable to change, or more ripe for change. rather than ripe for change as compared to other societies. So if a society is ripe for change, then you will need less force there, maybe, or less sustained force. So you might need it for one stage, but you might not need it once the change has been affected, for example, that much. It also depends on the ruling forces or ruling structures, how strong they are. How strong they are, as far as the resistance is concerned, they might be ripe for changes, as with relation to the society at large, but in themselves they might have greater or lesser resistance power. So the amount and the type of force you need also would vary. So we have to look at all these complexities. We can't just take the sentence of Marx on its face value. You can have a lot of force, physical force, but you might not be able to affect a change. You might be able to affect a change, but might not be able to sustain that change, despite having a lot of force, because you don't have the right type of force for the right type of context or the right type of stage. So you have to take all those accounts, all those niceties, or all those complexities into consideration when we are looking at the actual situation. So in actual history, it is a notorious fact that conquest, enslavement, robbery, murder, in short, force play the greatest part. Okay, so we just had a bit of go at different meanings and different contexts and different types of forces needed for different types of changes. This violent birth indicates that what is involved in a war conducted by all available means, including terror, and which seizes every possible opportunity to establish the new regime. So we're talking about this a bit more clear. At least these authors are talking about the revolution here, the new regime of power, and the new form of existence. So they're talking about force in the context of the birth of a new regime. So let's talk about that a bit. So I think there are three phrases here which are important. The first one is the violent birth. We're talking about the event here. And the second phrase is the violent birth indicates that what is involved is a war conducted by all available means, including terror, and which seizes every possible opportunity to establish the new regime of power. A new regime power. That's the second phrase which is important, a new regime of power. Okay, a new regime of power. And related to the second one is a new form of existence. Which would which would involve social existence, um, individual existence, I guess, as well, and the existence of institutions and structures as well. So the last, so it's talking about radical change, radical or fundamental change. Now, radical and fundamental changes can themselves be understood at least in two different ways. A radical total transformation can be divided into revolution, where you have obviously it's always a question of relativity, in the sense that every change keeps a lot of elements of the past. So every change can be seen in many different ways, but let's define revolution as a total transformation of one civilization to another. So these type of changes are rare. It happens after thousands of years, I guess. But we can also talk about radical changes within a particular civilization. So that would be a revolution in a more restricted sense. So civilizational revolution, when we talk about it, we might think of, for example, transition from mostly what we call Christendom in Europe to what we call modernity or capitalism, for example. So that's a sort of civilizational change. But like French Revolution, within that change, that's a revolution in more limited sense, for example, or glorious revolution within that change. And both glorious revolution and French revolutions are revolutions, but they are different. And they are revolutions in the limited sense, but then again, they are different in the way they actually happen. So that's why when we are talking about changes, whether they are revolution in the sense one or revolution in the more limited sense, we also need to differentiate between the process and the actual event. And the event sort of signify transition from one final transition from one regime or one civilization to the other one. so that the actual shift happens here. But that shift was made possible through a process which might last for centuries, and more than that if it is a more fundamental change or whatever. And sometimes the events are violent or spectacular, like that was in the case of French Revolution, or the case of Russian Revolution, or the case of Iranian Revolution. But those so they are very perceptible, very obvious. Other times the events are not that spectacular. Glorious Revolution, I mean, that is still spectacular, but not at the same level. So the shift from the process, and the process mostly are hidden, in the sense that only by looking back from the perspective of a new regime that we can understand those processes. So we have to differentiate in any fundamental change between the process and the event. Normally people focus on the event, and the events might be violent. The processes themselves can't just be violence, because they last for centuries, and then they pave the way for radical change. And I guess if the process is more entrenched, you might not need violent events, but it will depend on the existing system and its viability, and the ruling classes and their ferocity and their willingness to fight, and the structures and their strength and all those. So depending on then the processes and their types will, and their nature and the violence involved will be determined. Similarly with the event, and the event can be spectacular, less spectacular, or perceptible, even not perceptible at all. And there might not be a single event anyway. The transition can be seamless as well. So it all depends on the circumstances and on the context. And so when we talk about the total change, we should not just focus on event, but processes as well. And the type of violence Marx is talking about is mostly the violence which is related to the event itself, and the event may last for years as well, but that sort of violence cannot be part and parcel of a process, simply because it can't be sustained for so long. Processes must involve more. Processes involve violence, but that violence would be more sporadic, and processes must be based on more positive things, social engineering, social building of new institutions alongside the old institutions, building of new relations, new educational and training systems, etc., etc. So my point is that the sort of violence they're talking about here more pertains to events, and even in that case not to all types of events, all types of revolution. So just to sum up, we should differentiate in fundamental change, revolution in sense 1, revolution in sense 2. Like this revolution is within already existing system, so it's not a change of a system, but maybe a change of the mode of certain things within the systems. And also we should differentiate between process and event. So when we talk about a birth of new regime, power, and a new form of existence, then should ask the question whether it relates to this or it relates to this. And similarly, we should ask ourselves whether it relates to this or it relates to the event or the process, whether it is a revolution within an existing system, or it's a more fundamental revolution where one system is replaced by another system. So we'll stop here, and next time we'll continue from here. Thank you.